This is Jim Cowan from the Collaborative for Student Success, and this is the Route K-12 Exploring Education Recovery podcast. Each week, we travel the country on a kind of road trip to talk about the ways federal recovery dollars are being used in states to reshape education. Along the way, we'll hold up the best examples with the hope that those practices are repeated in other schools. Our guest today is Andy Rotherham, co-founder and partner at Bellwether, where he's worked to center data, effective policy analysis, and pragmatism across some of the deepest challenges facing our educational systems. He's advised both Democratic and Republican education leaders, and now serves on the Virginia Board of Education. He also authors the popular EduWonk blog and newsletter, I'm a Fan, where he considers hot-button education topics and, very importantly, I might add, showcases his passion for fishing, which I very much appreciate. Andy, thanks for joining us today.
Jim, thanks for having me. It's great to see you.
I want to point out one thing that I noticed last year on an image that you posted either on Facebook or somewhere, and it was of you going on a trip with your family and you pointing out the difference of, how some families may have a stack of fancy luggage and yours was a pile of duffel bags getting ready to go out on a trip. And I had to laugh because at that moment I was in Alaska with my family and I was literally staring at a pile of North Face bags that were just duffel bags piled up exactly the same way. So I think you and I have a very similar belief and passion for going on experiences and trips that are out into the wild, if you will, a little bit. And so I very much appreciated that and got a big chuckle.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. That was definitely probably on Facebook. I don't put pictures of my kids out on public social media, but yeah, it was a great trip. And I think you and I do share that sort of both two passions. One, like just going and having adventures with your family, but second, that prioritizing, like just doing things with your family. My wife and I, we're getting to the end. My kids are in high school and we're starting to think about, what's next for them. And, they're becoming young adults and like, it's such a precious time and it's so fleeting. I look back on some of those trips. I'm so glad that we did it. And honestly, for us, at least, I feel like the pandemic, kind of robbed of a year or two. We might be able to have some of those adventures.
Yeah, I totally agree. We enjoyed so much having, I have two kids and likewise, they're reaching those ends of their education where I know that, these sort of moments are fleeting. And we were out on a boat without any access to social media or anything like that. And we cherished those moments. So
Alaska is an amazing place. I've been fortunate to be up there a few times, and to be able to be there with my kids was the first time they had seen it. And it's just such a big place, and you see so much, and just an incredible ecosystem, and so different, the coast versus the interior. And just to be able to just spend time there. And we travel kind of slow and, kind of kick along. We did some of the Alaska Marine Highway System, the ferries. And like, it's such a mind-blowing place. And it's just a reason I'm just such a fan of sort of kind of experiential education and those, because it's just, Alaska's like nothing else. And you have to see it to really appreciate that. Yeah.
You do have to get up there and just see it to really appreciate where it stands.
As you know, I'm a pretty big booster of Virginia. Virginia's a pretty amazing place, pretty amazing ecosystem, a lot to do here, but like Alaska is kind of a close second.
Yeah, absolutely. So listen, the way that I start this kind of conversation is really the pretty broad question for you. And I respect your history with education systems and your personal experience. And I just want to get a sense from you, like, how are states doing right now? Like, we've been focusing a lot on recovery actions. That's the whole theme of this is how are states coming back? What can we hold up that looks good? But I just want to hear from you, like, how are kids doing? How do you think we're doing?
Well, there's a couple of questions there, like how are states doing, how are kids doing, and so forth. Yeah. I don't think students are doing well. I think we have plenty of evidence of that, and that's, on academics, and we keep seeing again and again data, and it's converging on this issue. There's like substantial academic learning loss, and people can dismiss, well, it's just one test or it's this or that. We're seeing it, we see it on national measures, we see it on state measures, we see it on customized vendor-driven measures that districts use. And it should alarm us. And then you've also got, like, issues around mental health and wellness. And, those were issues before the pandemic. It's easy to forget. The last decade, we've seen, rising issues with mental health in particular, that policymakers need to pay attention to. And then the pandemic sort of supercharged that because it was such a challenging, difficult time for so many people. And so I think in terms of how kids are doing, in general, you have to say we have a big problem. It's not every kid. There's kids who are thriving. I do think we don't talk enough about the kids who discovered during the pandemic that they sort of a competency, outcome-based education was great for them, a customized education, more control over their time. I think sometimes you can hear the narrative can be that that the pandemic was terrible for every kid. It wasn't. There was kids who thrived and really found themselves during that period as well. But for a lot of kids, it was difficult in some different ways. And I don't think we are. I don't think we're doing what we need to do in terms of a sense of urgency to address that.
I want to talk about something that's on your EduWonk site, blog, and it was something you asked Tim Daly about, and you asked him to post. And we should probably get Tim on here to talk about it as well. But I thought it was interesting because this traditional narrative, and we have been the same way, right? Like we've been talking about. If students are struggling because school's closed, the solutions that we need to be thinking about are getting back to in-person learning, looking at how much lost instructional time was there, replacing that with really good investments in high dosage tutoring or potentially extra time for instruction. And Tim's comments were about there's some other potential problems there that couldn't complete the narrative. And it may be around just this notion of screen time, right? Like kids have now had so much more exposure to their phones. Is that an impact? I'm just wondering what you took away from that when he put that together for you.
Yeah, I mean, I was so glad he agreed to write that. He and I had been talking about that, and I was like, would you write it? I think it's a hard issue as a parent. I mean, I can tell you, and I think I said this in the setup to the piece, if I could have one thing over as a parent, parenting's all about just making lots of mistakes, but usually they're not like super consequential, hopefully. But the big one I would want back, if I got just one, would be technology and like my kids' relationship with technology. I think like a lot of parents, we weren't as attentive to that as we should be. So I'm not like some scold like, I think we screwed that up. And I think so Tim's raising a really important, it's elevated. It's not like they're all watching its academic content at any grade, and that obviously varies. There's differences that even by demographic and so forth. I don't think it's like a cut and dry case, but I think what Tim is talking about, we ought to look at it and we ought to be willing to ask some serious questions and how much time kids are spending on things like YouTube and what they're doing and how that might be related. What does that mean in terms of, not reading printed content? What does it mean educationally? So I was glad he put it out there. I think we should talk about it. And we have to recognize, there's a whole industry that wants kids to be on their phones and their devices as much as possible. I mean, these things are designed for engagement. And so we have to have some independence to ask some questions and figure out like what is good and not good here. We shouldn't expect, we wouldn't trust any other industry to do anything like that for us. We should ask some hard questions.
Yeah, I know. I appreciated you asking him that question because it is a tough one and it deserves more consideration, I think for sure.
And again, I think it's hard for parents. There's a lot of guilt, right? And so it can be a hard question for parents to want to be like, did we, is this, did I make a mistake? Did I let my kids use apps they shouldn't at an age they shouldn't or whatever? And kids are getting this younger and younger. And I do think the big thing Tim points up is this reading issue, right, encouraging kids to read. And it's hard to miss. Like we have, like that is declining, and that is probably a problem based on at least what we know about how humans acquire knowledge.
Yeah. So along, sort of the same theme around, what are the practices that are making a difference? How do you think, how do you think states are doing as far as measuring progress right now? Are we too early into this? What are some of the strengths or challenges of efforts to sort of track spending and like tying that to what's working?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a huge problem with transparency. I mean, the work you guys did, I thought it was interesting. You guys have had this honesty gap for a long time. And you saw, and this is before I was on the Virginia board, but Glenn Youngkin picked that up. One of the first things he tasked the Department of Education with doing was coming up with a report on what's going on. It was called the Honesty Gap, and sort of just laid out, here's what achievement's like in Virginia. Here's what the achievement measures are like. And here's, here's context that you should know about those in terms of level of rigor. And of course, that set off a huge debate, even though pretty much everything in it has been subsequently confirmed by other data. So I think there's a problem with states leveling with people about where we are. That's always been a problem, and it's particularly acute after the pandemic. And in part because, look, the data, we had 2 years of really interrupted assessments, so you don't have clean trend lines and so forth. Right. And we've never been particularly good at this. And so it's both those things. So I think there's a lot of confusion among parents. It's really fascinating that parents continue to be worried about, they think everybody else's kid is struggling, but theirs is doing fine. If you see that in the data, like that's obviously a mathematical impossibility, but we haven't been communicating with them. How many states are actually affirmatively really making sure, equipping teachers to make sure? Some of the professional development right now it's the opposite. It's equipping teachers to obfuscate around this. And so, there's this real popular approach to like street data and like talk about all these other data points that you should talk to parents about. If you're serious about telling parents what went on during the pandemic and what they need to do, you should be very forthrightly telling them math and literacy and where their kids are. And instead, we've got superintendents saying, oh, don't worry about things like the NAEP. That's not a big issue. Pay attention to our state tests or this other thing. And so there's a lot of irresponsibility out there. There's just a lot of lack of capacity and so forth. And I don't think we're doing a good job, like clearly cutting through it. I think this is an area where the media is trying, but there's not enough focus on it, a sustained focus as well. The NAEP scores, I mean, that was catastrophic, and like it kind of came and went. Now we're back to like, people, yammering on about a teacher shortage that is not nearly as acute as you would think from the headlines.
When we did the Honesty Gap with Achieve, the idea back then was to look at the NAEP scores and then see how states were also recording proficiency at the same time. And those deltas were, a good indicator of like, okay, how transparent, how truthful are states being about student progress? And the answer to that was, well, I think it's a strong argument for, holding a higher bar, for having a good measurement, for having a good system of accountability in the state. And that was the reason for doing the whole campaign. Now it feels like, as you kind of said, like, I don't know if it fits. I don't know if it's a perfect, translation, because people have asked us like, well, we should redo the Honesty Gap. And I'm like, I'm not sure if it's going to measure the same have the same impact as it did before, because of the reasons that you had said. Our friends at Learning Heroes put out some research basically saying that 92% of parents believe their children are on or above grade level. And the NAEP results completely contradict that. And as you mentioned, the NAEP results came and the NAEP results went. And have we sufficiently communicated or instilled the need to address that across the nation, particularly with the parent community?
Yeah, I don't think we have instilled that demand. And I think it's erratic support from political leaders. Some political leaders are very focused on this. Others are not. There's a lot of pressure to not talk honestly and candidly about this. There's professional development that's very much aimed at making sure people aren't talking candidly about this. This whole, like, let's talk about street math and these things. And so I think, or street data, and these things. So I think we need a concerted effort. I mean, it could start obviously with the White House. The president has the most powerful bully pulpit in the country. His wife's an educator. It could start with letting people know you need to really be aware of where your kid is and what's going on, and here are resources and so forth. You need to be asking your school, there's $190 billion out there to address this. The most recent slug was more than 100 billion of that. Explicitly for this. Ask questions. What is your school district doing? How are they helping you? What resources are they making available? What are they doing? I mean, the good news we're starting to see in the data is like, the bleeding is stopping, which is good, but now it's about the recovery. What are you doing to help recover? What are you doing to identify kids who are most at risk? We really run the risk as we have just a lost cohort of kids from this who weren't taught to read properly. And so they're going to sort of drift through school, but there'll be a big dropout echo that starts to show up 10, 12 years from now, things like that, asking really hard questions. And then governors can obviously do that, state boards of education. people need to see their role here as not boosters or advocates for the system per se, but rather as regulators of it. And we need to make sure everything's in place, make sure it's serving kids well. That urgency is not there in any sort of a consistent way. And that has to change, because you got to get the demand side of this right. And then the politics will respond.
Yeah. And yet we've seen, this very large parent empowerment come across the country, but we've certainly seen that in the great Commonwealth of Virginia, and you're on the Virginia Board of Education. What do you think the movement is sort of meant towards Virginia schools, and what are you hopeful for? With there's that much attention, but what are you hoping that the parents will focus on?
Yeah, well, parents' rights means a lot of things to a lot of different people, but basically this idea that schools need to be more transparent about what's going on and more responsive to parents at a general level, I think it's like it's hard. People do it, but it seems really hard to argue with that. There's plenty of examples. And look, we're not going to be able to have an a la carte curriculum on demand. Part of being in a public school is these decisions get made and so forth. And so you're not going to be able to have, every parent cannot have input on everything that goes on. But we're nowhere near having that problem. We've got the opposite problem. Parents are not getting, they feel like they're getting strong armed. It makes them mad. That's a big part of why Glenn Youngkin won. And look, people were angry about closures, and they felt like they were strong armed with closures. And then you throw onto it various political agendas and so forth that people were experiencing in the schools. It was obviously a combustible situation. What's inexplicable to me is that the Democrats have not come up with their own parents' rights agenda, right? Like and so like being against parents' rights in America in 2022 seems like an insane political position. And so come up with your own and talk about, and I think that would actually have a clarifying function, because I suspect there's a fair amount of overlap. This stuff gets, all wrapped up in culture war stuff, but most parents want to know, like, if my kid's taking surveys on things, like, do I have a right to review and know what's on that survey? If my kid's going to be giving counseling, I want to know if that counseling's about it and what's going to go on. And then you could add to that stuff like, what's your right to know that the curriculum in your school is being used is actually evidence-based, that reading is being taught in a way that is evidence-based? What's your right to know about sort of the qualifications of instructional staff? What's your right to know about your students' level of achievement and transparency? I mean, these are things that, like, I think there's an enormous sort of centrist consensus around a lot of these things, and the Democrats have just left the field kind of wide open, which it's just sort of inexplicable.
We're coming up on the end of the year as we're starting into 2023. Where should the focus be?
I mean, first, the focus has to be, again, on recovery. This field can be really feckless. We're still having arguments about, like, do you call, you'll be in meetings, I'm sure you've been in some of these meetings where somebody says learning loss. And instead of talking about what the hell are we going to do to make up for these pandemic decisions that were made around policy and so forth that have so disadvantaged kids, it devolves into 20 minutes about whether you should call it learning loss or unfinished learning. And, like, I mean, if we just can't name that this catastrophe unfolded, how are we supposed to solve it? And so what needs to happen in 2023 is just a degree of seriousness that really I think everybody, spring of 2020 was an incredibly difficult and chaotic time. We didn't understand what was going on with COVID. I think most people are like, everybody deserves a lot of grace for decisions that you had to close schools. I think there are a few people arguing any kind of good faith who want to go back and like relitigate decisions that were made in March of 2020. No, we just didn't know what was going on. It's certainly not March of 2020 or April 2020 now. And it really wasn't by like summer when you started to realize there was things you could do to start to mitigate this and so forth. And there was still so little urgency. It became incredibly toxic. I mean, you go back and look at like conversations on Twitter with people, like the things people were saying to each other about like whether or not schools should reopen we're just crazy. We need to have some grace, but we need to say there was a lack of urgency after about summer of 2020 about how are we going to get schools, get education to kids, reopen, get content, deliver content to kids, particularly in places where that was not going to be able to happen effectively online. What kind of options need to be available? We're still having like rolling forward, that's still sort of lack of urgency. So we've got a lot of kids who are really behind. that is not equally or equitably distributed. It's kids who were furthest from opportunity before the pandemic are in many cases even further now. And you see that again and again in the data. You can say that everybody was affected. It was, but the effects were not equal. This was particularly low income kids who were disproportionately likely, Black and Hispanic kids really took it on the chin in terms of decisions that were made and the education they delivered. We've got to get serious about addressing that, or we will lose them. And this idea that you hear that, oh, well, they learned more out of school and all this is just ridiculous. We did not do what we need to do and are still not doing what we need to do to prepare these kids to have lives of agency and choice. And that is not going to show up immediately, but it will show up. It will show up over time. The data is really clear on this. People, everybody's looking at it. Where is that political urgency to get that right?
We had Kirsten Basler from North Dakota on this podcast, and she brought up a really interesting program that they're doing in North Dakota around board governance. And it is focused entirely on student outcomes. It is about helping new board members who have come in and are really good at getting elected, but may not know how to jump into this job and where the majority of their time should be spent. And it's really fascinating to hear how they are orienting these new board members into really developing goals that are focused entirely on student outcomes and metrics of success that the community decides, that is based on the vision of the community that they're serving. And I think it hits on what you're saying about, just focusing on the things that matter for kids to get them back on track, and having that framework gives them a strong tool to throw out the things that are distracting in their work. And we had to applaud. I don't know if you've heard that or not.
Yeah, I have. I think what she's doing is terrific. She's I think just very interesting, very interesting leader on schools up there. There's two schools of thought really about like what should boards do, whether that's local boards or state boards. And one of those schools of thought is sort of, you need to tell people a good story, a good political narrative that's going to keep them bought in. They're going to support public schools. And that's what's going to get them to pay their taxes and send their kids and be supportive. And so it's a little bit of a, don't talk about the bad news, emphasize the good news. Right. And this is, you see this, like even pre-pandemic, when NAEP scores came out, if they weren't great, you would still see these press releases where people would figure out the one green shoot. And instead of talking about everything that was wrong, it would be, left-handed 8th grade, Hispanic girls, are up 1 point, and that would be like the title of the press release. Meanwhile, most groups, achievements down. And that's sort of this public relations strategy to doing all this. The other strategy, which is the one I'm obviously adhere to more, is just being realistic about achievement. I think you can't fool people. You are better off leveling with them. They're going to figure it out anyway, and they're going to be twice as mad if they think you were not playing straight pool with them. There's going to be even more of a backlash. And so if you look at the problems we're having after the pandemic, huge declines in enrollment, and it doesn't take much to destabilize finances. We've got this fiscal cliff coming. You've got this enormous problem with learning loss. We ought to level with people, not in a way that's hysterical and trying to create a crisis atmosphere, but just says, here's where things are, here's what we're doing, and so forth. I think that is actually a healthier politics. If you care about the survivability and sustainability of public schools over time, that's a better way to do it. But there's a real disagreement. And so I think what Basler's doing in terms of helping train board members to think about this and communicate about this is really important. I wish there was more training for board members. I hope it does not become ideological. I think it'll be really unfortunate if we wind up with sort of a conservative and a liberal way to train board members. I think there's people are going to disagree on this stuff, but there's some best practices that should cut across political lines of difference that we should make sure people have. And then just again, that ethos question. What is your job? It is your job to sort of be a booster and an advocate, or to be a regulator? I think that's a fundamental question you can train people on. Yeah, I am excited to see this being approached from as you said, a non-partisan, non-ideological way. What is the blocking and tackling that needs to be done in avoiding some of that? So yeah, and where you asked what's going well, also help people realize there is stuff. We can see idea. I get very frustrated with this sort of idea that nothing works, and that people are oh my gosh, been doing this for 30 or 40 years and nothing works. That's not true. You can see in the data, there's plenty of evidence of what works, policies, improvement in practice. I mean, lots of things. Standards in this country are like substantially better than they were 10, 15 years ago. Like we make progress. That's not the issue. It's figuring out where we're falling short, how to talk about that, how to learn about that and think about that. Where are examples that you can use? Like that's more the conversation. That does take, if you're a new board member, someone new in one of these roles, that takes a degree of education and so forth. And we can help people up along the learning curve with that.
You've written some pieces around the challenges and the silos that are occurring because of pandemic fatigue, and I hear about this effort at Bellwether called Assembly. What are you all doing with that? What is your hope for that effort?
Well, thanks. Yeah, thanks for asking. I didn't even put you up to that, so I really appreciate
you. Didn't pay me for that.
No, I really appreciate you asking. So yeah, look, we talked earlier about ed tech and the effect on kids, and and screens and so forth. But I mean, it hasn't had a great effect on adults. We should probably name that as well. I mean, I think like Twitter is like a reputation destroyer in terms of you watch people on there who you thought were sort of serious people, and you see some of the stuff that gets said, and so everyone's in their silos. And this again was a pre-pandemic problem, but it's definitely more acute. And so the whole beta initiative is we've got these big structural problems, education redlining, which has, really horrible roots in American history and is a contemporary problem in terms of school segregation. You have, this inability of kids to navigate post-secondary options. We're looking at one on school boards, what we were just talking about, like making school boards much more broadly accessible to a wider cross-section of Americans than can seriously consider school board service today. And then this assembly one, which is we know how to like wrap really good services around kids. The affluent do this all the time, packaging their kids up for college, all of this. Like, why can't we do that in a more equitable manner? And there's examples of things that have, done that. Like, for example, when Jeb Bush was governor in Florida, he made SAT prep much more available. That's a much more common strategy now. When he did it, it was more unusual. These ways to wrap, but we want to take it to a whole nother level. How can you like assemble fully an education around a kid with everything a parent needs to do that? So information, navigation, transportation, all the infrastructure, as well as like good providers of services and so forth. And this idea that, a much more customized education has just enormous promise, but it is not equitably available at all right now. And it could be. And some of that is very much pandemic informed in terms of what we saw with some of the services that sprung up, wraparound things, pods, stuff like that. But some of it are these longer standing issues. And it's a terrific sort of collision because you do have greater demand for choice coming out of the pandemic. You've seen an enormous number of policy changes. And so all these things are sort of converging. And so Assembly is giving us opportunity to bring together really disparate people who often aren't in the room together, but share a goal of a more equitable and customized education, to work together to figure out how do we go about doing that and what's the policies that need to support. And the coolest part about it, I know this is a long answer to a short question, but we're very excited about it, is at the end of all of these different beta projects, there's a handoff. So we're handing it off to people in the field to carry the work forward. Depending on the project, that's going to be different kinds of entities or institutions or policy groups or whatever. But this isn't about like Bellwether doing this stuff. We're really good at designing, bringing it together, doing all that. We're handing it off to leaders in the field to drive it forward. And I think that's just a really terrific impact strategy we're very excited about.
Where can we learn more about this?
At our website, so bellwether.org /assembly, or if you go there, you'll see for Assembly. You can also, if you go to the Edgewonk blog, you can easily, edgewonk.com, find your way to Bellwether, or if you find me on Twitter at A Rotherham, you can also find your way very easily to Bellwether from there.
Andy, thanks for your time today. I appreciate it. So much happening, and I think it's a tough time to be in education, but it's an exciting time to be in education.
Yeah, I agree, Jim. I don't quite understand why people are so down. There's this enormous potential and plenty of good examples. And honestly, I think the time we're in, like you're seeing a lot of subsurface conversations about some pretty incredible innovation. I get, in my experience, sort of just when things seem like they're bleakest, there's actually cool stuff happening that's just out of sight, and then it pops up, and I'm aware of, some of that stuff. And I'm actually I'm optimistic if we can get this political piece around demand right. And I'm grateful, and I really mean this, to people like you who are just out there trying to continue to force that conversation, create that demand, and are just sort of tirelessly staying at it. It's great. So it's great to be with you today. Thanks a lot. Hope you get more adventures and keep bringing those fish in. You as well. We need to find a time to wet a line around here together. Definitely. All right. Thanks, Andy. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you. This is Jim Cowan from the Collaborative for Student Success. Thanks for listening to today's episode of Route K-12, Exploring Education Recovery, where each week we showcase ways federal recovery funds are reshaping schools by talking to the people doing the hard work to educate America's kids. Reach out to us at edurecoveryhub.org/Route K-12 or follow us on Twitter at our handle @StudentSuccess.